This is The Express with Gary Allen, your 360-degree view of the world. Now, here's your host, Gary Allen.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The Express, this edition. I indeed am Gary Allen, and we have a very exciting show for you tonight. Our Gary Patterson will be joining us. Of course, you might remember him from a couple of months ago. He's a musical historian, a teacher, author, and lecturer. We'll get into some of the books he's written over the years, everything from about Paul McCartney's supposed death to the rock and roll legends, myths, and curses that go along with some of the rock and roll heroes of our time. I will also remind you that if you would like to get in touch with me through Facebook, you can go to Gary Allen, A-L-A-N, at The Express. If you want to just say hello and befriend me, I certainly would love to hear from all of you out there. And I also want to say a special hello to our good friend Randy. He listens every weekend, or every show, rather, and I'm very, very pleased to have him on board, as well as many of you out there who listen on a regular basis. Next week, we have a very interesting guest for you, Mr. Steve Cox. He's a huge event planner. I've worked with him on a number of events over the years, and when I say huge event planner, most of the people that go to these events number in the 30 to 40,000 person range, attendees. The last one that he did was here in the Orlando area. J-Lo was the entertainment for the SAP convention. He's currently going to be doing something up in Indianapolis, his home state, home city, which will have something to do with IBM, and that too will be attended by 30 or 40,000 people at least. He's also part of a new foundation called Songs for Life. I can't wait to talk to him, and that's coming up next week, Mr. Steve Cox. We have a lot of exciting new things also coming on board very, very soon, with a lot of new and interesting guests coming on, particularly this fall. But for the most part, I am very pleased to see which way the program is going. I'm very pleased to have all of you on board with us. As I said, we're waiting for Gary Patterson to join us here in just a couple of minutes. And, it's going to be an exciting show. And if you're fans of rock and roll and you like legends and myths and stories and all about the curses, well, I think you're going to enjoy this show absolutely 100%. So with that being said and done, like I said, we're just kind of waiting for Gary to join us. By the way, this weekend I'm going to go and see the Rolling Stones, which may very well end up being the last time that here in the Orlando area that we get to see them. I know Gary's going to be seeing them up in his neck of the woods, so I'm sort of excited about that. And like I said, for any of you who wish to join us anytime, all you have to do is just go into the chat room and write down whatever you want, and EW will kind of interrupt us a little bit and tell us about one of the questions that you may very well have. So with that being said, like I said, I'm just waiting here for Gary. EW, I'll tell you what, let me give Gary a call. And let's see what's happening. In the meantime, if you'd play a little bit of music, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Let's find something really quick. We'll just go to Funky Town.
Gary.
Yes, I think we've
It's Gary.
Yes, hey, how are you? Good evening, and thank you so much. Sorry about that. I got a little frightened that maybe you weren't going to be able to join us after all tonight.
No, I think our clocks weren't synchronized, but
Absolutely.
I'm here now.
Probably not. Let me introduce you first. Here's our Gary Patterson, teacher, author, lecturer, and musical historian. He's written such books as The Walrus Was Paul, Hellhounds on the Trail, Tales of the Rock and Roll Graveyard, Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends, and Curses. Gary has also been a consultant with ABC Radio. He's also appeared on ABC Radio, Radio Coast to Coast, VH1, where you are consultant, also in the E-Network's Doomed to Die. You've also talked a great deal about The Curse of 27, which we will get into a little bit later on. You've lectured all over the world, and thank you so much, Gary, for taking a few minutes out of your day to join us. Earlier, I said something before we get into the very first question, which will be the same one that I asked you the last time, and that is, this week, I'm going to catch the Rolling Stones, which may very well be the last time that I see them in Orlando. And you're going to catch them, I guess, next weekend up in your neck of the woods.
Yes, I am.
Do you think this is going to be it for them? I mean, when is it? When does 71 or 72 years old CPR and rolling you on the stage finally come to an end, and you say, "I've had enough"? You know.
Well,
I mean, I can't. Yeah, that's true.
Late 80s, a lot of the old blues guys, they go on. I think that it's a lifestyle. I think that it may not be the financial rewards, though I'm sure that they enjoy the money, but I think that's all they've known. When they started in England, they hit the stage. I mean, you take a look at what are the greatest rock bands in the world, and people argue Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, but who's out there doing it? I'll tell you. I saw Paul McCartney. Kim and I saw Paul McCartney in October, and he's 72, and he played for 3 hours without taking a break or without taking a drink of water. And he's out there doing it. Now, does his voice sound as great as it did in, between 64 and 68 or even up to the 70s when he did his solo album? Some of his high notes he has to strain to reach. But, the guy's 72 years old, and he's still rocking. He has the greatest songs you could ever hear. And who else would you rather hear playing?
Yeah.
I mean, I've had people argue about Satisfaction, how much they hate Satisfaction. I happen to know you like it, don't you, Gary?
Oh, I love that song and Painted Black. I want to tell you,
Yeah.
when I hear that, if they play that Friday night rather, I'm going to go up through the roof. Now, I love that song, and I love Satisfaction because it was in a movie that I was in, and that was Apocalypse Now. So, I mean, you were in Apocalypse
Now? I'm learning all kinds of things about you, Gary. You were in Apocalypse Now?
Yeah. I nothing major, nothing that you can, I spent 4 months in the Philippines, which was supposed to be 4 days. That's when Martin Sheen had his nervous breakdown. But that's, that's a story about me that's just as soon left in the closet in a sense, because that was a wild time in the Philippines. But it was cathartic for me, I will tell you. Having served in Nam, it was cathartic. We were over there doing
I can see that.
Our little, yes, absolutely. But no, I just think there reaches a point where you start to say, when are these rock and rollers of today going to finally say, well, we know they're not doing it for the money. The Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger,
Sure.
and Jagger and McCartney are the two richest rock and rollers that are in the business. Somebody tried to tell me a few weeks ago about someone else, but the truth is, if you look it up and you find it, and what a lot of people may not be aware of is that Jagger got a degree, I believe, in economics from one of the universities in London, or in England, rather. And I know McCartney has done very well with his own sound book after he had to get away from Michael. So they don't need the money. The Who don't need the money. So obviously they're doing it because they love to do it. So,
right.
Yeah, Gene Simmons. Someone just emailed me. Gene Simmons. Simmons is very wealthy. There's no doubt about it. And EW just sent that message to me. Yeah, Gene Simmons is very wealthy, but I just look at these guys. They're doing it because they love to do it. It has to be. It's the same as me. I love to do what I'm doing here on the radio with you. So I'm going to go back to the very first question that I asked you then, and you laughed then, and you probably will again now. How does a mild-mannered history teacher, European history teacher, and literature expert suddenly become one of the most foremost authorities on rock and roll myths, legends, and curses in the world?
I am laughing.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I got to tell you, I grew up with the music. And there was something about music that just touched me. When I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 when they came on, I mean, it was a epiphany for me because I was into the music. And then the Stones. And a lot of people really complain about Satisfaction, how overrated that song is. Well, let me tell you, you go back to the year Satisfaction was released and you tell me what sounded better. Because, yeah, we can look back 30, 50 years and say, yeah, well, that song, it's not so good. Let me tell you, go to that time period, it was something that just changed you. And when I had this great love for music, I played the guitar, I played in bands, I played in sessions in Nashville and some other places like that. I got to know personalities. I would hear the stories. And when I heard the stories, researched, got into it, I'm the luckiest guy in the world, Gary, because I get to do what I love. And I'm not 72. I've still got many years before that, I hope. But the bottom line is that I'm going to still be doing that till the end because the stories, people want to hear the stories, people in a new generation who grow up and they say, oh, wow, this is interesting. But see, the way I did it is I didn't want to just write biography pieces on bands. Mm-hmm. I had to look for what would be considered to be my niche, which is if you take rock and roll and you cross it with the Twilight Zone, then you've got some pretty good stories. And whether it's a myth or whether it's a legend, there's a thin line there because a legend is basically based on some truth. And I guarantee you, when you read my books, you probably won't listen to those records the same way again. Because there's a lot of interesting things that went on at the time period, and it's a part of a social history. I know that as a teacher, I was looking at a test generator and in American history, and it had this question. It said, which of the following artists was not on Motown? And it said, number 1, The Temptations, number 2, Aretha Franklin, number 3, James Brown, or number 4, Jimi Hendrix. Mm-hmm. Well, they all had one thing in common. They're all African-American artists, but there was only one artist on Motown in that question, and that was the Temptations. The question should have read, which artist was the only one to be on Motown? Because Aretha Franklin and James Brown, they weren't on Motown. Neither was Hendrix. Hendrix was the answer. But see, people are ignorant of social history.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to study American history in high school. Now you're going to hear some of the names, but you're not going to hear the names of the people who changed the world as teenagers. Mm-hmm. And it was an incredible social revolution. And you lived through it. I lived through it.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact,
we did.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we discussed it the last time about how the British invasion and everything kind of changed music, and it started to change a little bit before then. Which brings me up to the follow-up question to that. Question from back then. For those of you that weren't listening, the British invasion helped change American music, but it was really American music that helped change the British influence on us because it was the blues. It was the blues that Mick Jagger and the Beatles and the Who and all the other groups at that time listened to when the American performers would go over there. And then they just brought it back over here. So really, it was an American influence brought on by the British picking up on it more so than our homespun entertainers that really helped change the American view of music and helped change the music industry forever.
Yes, and they brought it back to us with British accents. Now, here's the thing. If you're talking about the Stones, how did the Stones start? You had Keith Richards, who just happened to walk into Mick Jagger on a subway lift and noticed that in Jagger's hand he had a Chuck Berry album and one by Muddy Waters. And he said, hey, you want to start a band? And then they found Brian Jones. So, yeah, what you're saying is true. And when you throw in the Beatles were a little different. If you take the Yardbirds and you take the Stones, they were devoted to Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf. That was the sound. That's why Clapton left the Yardbirds, because when For Your Love came on, he thought it was too pop. He wanted to be a pure blues man. So that's why he left. But here's the other thing, Gary. If the Yardbirds had not had Jeff Beck on guitar, they would have been more like a John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, because Jeff Beck revolutionized psychedelic rock. But if you look at the Beatles, you know, they were more into R&B, which is Motown.
Right.
But they also love, there's country involvement there. If you listen to Carl Perkins, they love Carl Perkins. And Carl Perkins was the only artist, I think he had 4 songs the Beatles recorded, and the Beatles really didn't do that. They wrote their own material. So you had that country influence. But the thing is that when they came back and they did those songs, and it was with British accents and the harmonies, you know, we thought they wrote it. When I saw the Rolling Stones on the Ed Sullivan show, they did Little Red Rooster. Well, I thought they'd written that song. You know, I hadn't heard about Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf because black artists were not played on white radio stations.
That's true, yes.
They were called race records. And what happened is when the Stones came out and they idolized Muddy Waters and met him at Chess Records where they wanted to record, they brought Muddy back to England. They brought Howlin' Wolf. They did the sessions, and they broke through that social barrier. And then you had black artists sharing what we had not heard. We hadn't heard Manish Boy. The Stones knew. They were shocked that we hadn't heard this stuff. And, of course, the Beatles also and Chuck Berry. But when you take a look at it, music changed. And it came back to us, and it lifted some chains in social history.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I remember seeing on a PBS station where the Stones were performing in Chicago, and they stayed an extra couple of days because they went to see the blues players that used to be on the south side of Chicago and even on the north side of Chicago because they were so into it. And yes, you're right. The Beatles wrote their own music, and at first the Stones played a lot of cover. They were almost like a cover band at the beginning. They were playing a lot of other people's music, as a lot of the lads from England were doing. But, you know, the influence on them came from us, and then they came back and gave it to us. And, yeah, you're right. It was shocking that a lot of the American youth, and I'm just as guilty of it as anybody else, wasn't aware of excuse me, the black artists that were performing at the time. But again, back on white radio, it didn't occur. It was something that just didn't occur. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of your books. Okay, I want to get into that. The last time we really didn't get in depth that far. Hellhounds on Their Trail. Where in the name of time, Gary, did you come up with that title?
All right. The first chapter in the book was on Robert Johnson. And Robert Johnson had a song called Hellhounds on My Trail. And, of course, the mystique with Johnson was that he had sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where Highway 61 crosses Highway 39. And, you know, the idea was, I thought that song, Hellhounds on My Trail. Then I started thinking, well, you know, there were a lot of tragedies in rock and roll, so why don't we open it up and call it Hellhounds on Their Trail? Because when Robert Johnson died, shortly after he became very famous, he was poisoned. Took him 3 days to die. He was 27 years old. And then as I was researching some of the characters, I mean, if you're going to talk about tragedy in rock and roll, you're going to talk about Brian Jones, you're going to talk about Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, and the list goes on. Well, they have one thing in common, Gary. They were all 27. So what if the premise was that when Robert Johnson opened up whatever he did at that crossroads, and as Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Jimmy Page will tell you, they consider him to be the actual father of rock and roll blues guitar that influenced them. And, you know, what if there was something open up to that sort of cursed a lot of the figures? And so in Hellhounds on the Trail in 1998, I came up with a chapter that was called The Club, the 27 Club, the Curse of 27. And the next thing I knew, you know, when I wrote the book and I put all these strange similarities in there and talked about, you know, how would people look at it rationally? Well, you know, some people really believe in astrology and numerology. And you take 2 plus 7, it makes 9. It has a numerological background. You do 2 plus 7. The 2 and the 7 in numerology have certain traits. Right. And you take a look at astrology. And you take a look at, well, you know, 9 is the only single digit that's multiplied by another single digit that will equal 9. So it always goes back. 9 plus, 9 times 2 is 18, 1 plus 8 is 9. 9 times 9 is 81, 8 plus 1 is 9. And it all goes back. So it's a cycle. A woman carries an infant 9 months in her womb. And, so there's people who believe that, and they believe that there's a first stage of life that goes through 27. And at that stage, if you've learned all your lessons, according to people who believe in reincarnation and everything else, and I got to tell you, I got that from Ray Manzarek, because when we did VH1 Confidential,
right,
Jim Morrison died at 27, and so I listened to Ray Manzarek tell that story. But, it's like a wheel of, how you adapt and how you create, and if you're ready to move on to a greater plane. So, to me, it was just like how odd it is. So when I did my book, and actually I have the chapter in Take a Walk on the Dark Side, which is a much better version of Hellhounds.
Yes.
It's a strange story between the two. But what happened was that I went with a major artist. I didn't go like the Paul is Dead rumors. I didn't say, well, Otis Redding, he was 26. He was in his 27th year. See, I didn't want to do that because that sounded like, it's too hokey. Same thing with Graham Parsons. But they would have been, nice little people to have in there.
Right.
But I went to straight 27s all the way down the line. Well, one night on Coast to Coast, this guy who was getting his PhD in statistics called into the show, and he said, I want you to know, for a project, I took the age of all rock stars that I found, and just at the age of their death,
right,
starting with Richie Valens, who was only 17, all the way up to maybe like a B.B. King at 89. And he said, when I put it all in, he said, the number one age for rock stars is 27. Over 43 rock stars died at that age. Now, what do you think, Gary? I mean, you think, well, they live, their lifestyles may have something to do with that? Maybe. Because they fly a lot. But, we've had American presidents fly all over the world. They've not had plane crash.
No.
Think about that. Of course, they don't fly Beechcraft Bonanzas either.
No, and they don't fly old DC-3s that somebody else owned. Yeah,
flying from South Carolina to Louisiana, the Leonard Skinner story. But, they don't. Maybe they have a risky lifestyle. But, not all of them died from drugs. Not all of them died from, they're just strange things like electrocution on stage. I mean, stepping in a puddle of water while you're grounded. Things like that are just odd. And, that it would happen to that one age group. So if you have 43 rock stars. Now, I was headed to Florida a few years ago. And my phone number was blasted as I was headed down to Daytona Beach for a week. And when my phone was blasting, I was taking these calls, and I found out that Amy Winehouse had just died.
Yeah,
and
we
of course,
talked about
the thing
that,
with
yeah.
Amy Winehouse, she was 27. So I bet I did, that week, I did 30 radio interviews explaining what this meant by the curse of 27 and the 27 Club or Forever 27. And I know that a lot of rock stars have that in the back of their mind because John Mayall was writing an article in BMI magazine, which is a trade magazine, and a question came to him and said, John, what do you think your greatest accomplishment's been so far? And his answer was, well, I made it past 27.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? What do you think, Gary, is a contributing factor? And then we're going to get into the Buddy Holly story because that's fascinating in this book. What do you think is the contributing factor that they burn out so fast? I mean, is it the fact that you got to start so young now in the rock and roll business, or even back then, that you reach a certain age and, well, although we defied that earlier in the program, but nevertheless, most rock and rollers do start teenagers, etc. Do you think that they're just bad influences on them, or it's just the numbers? I mean, what do you think of the factors why at 27, or they don't even make it to 27 in some cases? Just they fly high and they burn out fast, or
well,
I
what
don't
do you say? It's better to burn out than fade away.
Yes.
I guess if you die at 27, you're immortal. Because everybody's going to say, "Well, man, that last album he did. Listen to these great songs." They don't see you falter. Yeah. They don't see you do bad albums. So I mean, there's something that says Yeah, a lot of rock stars would say, well, what did the Who say in my generation? I hope I die before I get old.
Yeah.
And, of course, they didn't make that promise, did they? I mean,
No, well,
it's
most of
not
them
good.
didn't. Well, at least three of them didn't anyway. The drummer did.
Yeah. Yeah,
Although
well,
he was probably past 27 by the time he died. But
Keith Moon lived a life of excess. And what did Jim Morrison say? Barred it from Blake. The road to excess, the road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom. And, you take a look at this, because here you are, you may be impoverished, and all of a sudden music is your way out.
right.
And then you need release, and then all at once everybody's giving you everything. They're giving you drugs, they're giving you clothes, they're giving you money,
Right.
they're giving you access that you never dreamed you would have. And that excess, that living on the edge, probably caught a lot of them. But,
Yeah.
look at the Stones, I mean, look at Keith Richards. How many people would think Keith Richards would be this old right now?
We're going to get into the Paul McCartney story a little bit later on in the program, but I got to do this, and you're probably going to laugh. But we're going to talk about whether Paul McCartney is Paul McCartney from then, and did he really die? Now I wonder. Bringing that up, this just went through my mind: is Keith Richards really Keith Richards that started out with all the blood transfusions that he's had? I mean, if you take a look at that man, he looks like Dracula. I swear to God, he looks like Dracula.
He looks like a poster child for drug abuse,
Oh, yeah.
This is what you'll look like if you do this. But one of the things about Keith Richards is that there's so many myths about him, like the full-body blood transfusion that he had before he had come to the United States.
Yeah.
That was false, obviously. But I was remembering what Don Felder said from the Eagles. He said that he had the opportunity to meet with the Stones manager, and they were going up to the room to meet Keith, and he said he walked into his room, and there was an amp that he always carries to play when he's in a hotel room, and they called his name, couldn't find him. They made a left turn in the suite, and there was Keith Richards laying face down in the bathroom, and he said his skin was gray, and he said, oh my God, he's dead, and it made him get out, and he left, and he was waiting all day to hear about the concert being canceled because Keith Richards had died. But that night at the show, as he was standing there watching it, here's Keith Richards playing guitar. So, maybe he is a vampire. Who knows?
Maybe we should be talking about Keith at the end of the show instead of the McCartney legend in Taking a Walk on the Dark Side. Taking a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends, and Curses. Buddy Holly, very interesting, bought an airplane from Jerry Lee Lewis. And if you would please take the story from there, because it's fascinating.
Well, actually, okay, it wasn't Buddy Holly. It was Rick Nelson.
Oh, it was Rick Nelson. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. And Ricky Nelson bought it, and Jerry Lee Lewis sold him the airplane because Jerry Lee was convinced that he would die in a crash in that plane.
Mm-hmm.
So he sold it to Ricky Nelson, who died in a crash in that plane.
Right.
And, which was so odd because it touched it. The very last song that Ricky Nelson played in concert in Guntherville, Alabama was Rave On by Buddy Holly.
Oh.
And then he gets in the plane, it crashes, he's killed. Sometimes you got to be careful with your last songs. But that was probably one of the cursed planes, and I probably would have been a better story if Jerry Lee had said, listen, I thought I was going to die in this plane. I want to warn you. But maybe he wanted to sell it too bad. But and, of course, the whole story about Ricky Nelson freebasing cocaine on the plane, all that was false, too. So,
there was a mechanical problem with the aircraft they discovered later, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. And,
Major.
And then, of course, so you're talking about Buddy Holly. A few months ago, they were going to reopen the investigation into the plane crash.
Mm-hmm.
And now they decided not to.
And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, when Buddy Holly died, along with him went the Big Bopper as well as Richie Valens. So it was three great artists who were killed in one airplane crash. Why didn't they reopen the investigation?
I have no idea. They said that they didn't have any new information, even though a pilot was the one who came up with a list of errors that they should reinvestigate. Now, I have to tell you, I know where the plane is.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's seen it since 1959. But let's just say there were a couple of individuals who wanted me to write a book on the version of what happened that night. And I just asked, I said, do you have a plane? And the answer was, well, we have most of it, including the steering wheel and ever going through all this part with it. And I thought, wow, wouldn't that be great for a TV documentary to actually see the parts of that plane and then go over the plane crash. Now, one of my best friends is Peggy Sue Gerron, who Buddy Holly wrote the song Peggy Sue for.
Ah.
And so, it's kind of nice because she spent her life trying to, she could fly, she got her pilot's license flying Beechcraft Bonanzas, trying to find out what happened to Buddy Holly. It's been a thing with her whole life now. And so I thought maybe that might be a cool story. Of course, a lot of people think, well, Buddy Holly, that's so outdated. But actually, you know who owns the Buddy Holly publishing catalog is Paul McCartney.
No wonder he's got a lot of money, yeah.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I was ignorant of Buddy Holly growing up. I'd heard the songs, but when I went into my record stores, which don't exist anymore, but I saw an album and it had this guy with these big, thick, black framed glasses. Yeah. I thought, gosh, that guy looks like a dweeb.
We'd call him a nerd today.
Yeah, he would be. And then when that movie with Gary Busey came out, everybody was reintroduced to the music. Mm-hmm. And I know Peggy Sue wasn't very happy with Gary Busey's performance of the songs. I think she wanted to lip sync Buddy Holly, but whatever it was, the music caught on again. And you say, wow, I thought Linda Ronstadt wrote that song, and then you found out just how incredible he was as an artist. And it sort of led you back to him. But that's one of the good goals of music. Like the Rolling Stones led us back to Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. Oh, yeah. Listening to seeing that movie in the early 70s brought us back to Buddy Holly, or brought me back to Buddy Holly.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of songs that you hear today these young kids are doing that go back a long, long way. The standards never die. If the kids catch on to them. No, they don't. The kids catch on to them, and they like them. And I went to I was working the concert the other night for now I know you're really gonna laugh. New Kids on the Block, and I was really shocked at the standards that they performed. And one portion of their show, they were on for 2 hours, and they did an incredibly wonderful job. So they sang a lot of standards, and it was really kind of neat to hear these young men do that kind of music. One of the things that's always amazed me about rock and rollers is they either burn out really fast in some cases, or they go penniless very quickly. How many artists have you talked to, or their wives, or their ex-wives, or their widows, or what have you, that talk about how fast the money came and went? People, I think, aren't aware out there, Gare, that the record labels aren't exactly forthcoming with the money as easily as people think they are. And they charge these guys for every little thing that these record labels do for them. The PR people, the press people, the airline travel. This all comes out of the artist's money. And sometimes the artist ends up nowhere. I think that's why many artists many years ago took their careers into their own hands, and they control their own money, like Jagger did, and McCartney, and others. But how about some of the stories of them that went broke? Not necessarily died, but just went broke because they either had a one-hit wonder or they had a couple of hits, like Dave Clark 5. I don't know how many of those guys are still around, but I don't think they were as rich as the Beatles ever were. That's for sure.
Well, no, you got to remember, a lot of those groups in British Invasion, they didn't write their own music. They took songs that came from them from the Brill Building, like Cynthia Weil, Barry Mann. They wrote the song, "We Got to Get Out of This Place." Well, who made a hit out of it? The Eagles. But who made the money from radio play was Barry Mann, Cynthia Weil. So they did great. Carole King, Jerry Goffin, they did great. And the British bands loved the songs. Look at Herman's Hermits. How much did they make from the original music? Yeah. And a lot of artists, when they get, well, I could tell you lots of stories, because I work with a company called Records on the Wall. So if you have anyone listening who is an artist who has not had his royalties, then they need to get in touch with me and Records on the Wall, because we'll find their money. And we have clients in England. We have clients all over the United States, some of the, the association groups like that. But, people who are not being paid fairly for the money they've made. And there's a number of reasons. First of all, sometimes it's not the record label's fault. The money's there. They just don't know where to send it. So you have to be able to reach out and get the money.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is read your contracts. There's a very famous group from Florida with a major, major hit song that their manager showed up in Waycross, Georgia with a contract, and he only had page 23. And he said, just sign this so we can get this record deal. Well, where was the rest of the contract? You don't need to see it. Just sign here. Well, when they signed it, they signed away all the royalties. There's a famous female artist whose husband sold away all her royalties. So she gets nothing because she sold away her writer's royalties. Brian Wilson's father signed away all his rights to all his early songs for $100,000, which was peanuts.
And I think that's why they fired their own father after a while.
Yeah, they called him Murray the Monster. But the idea is, I haven't seen the new Brian Wilson movie. I need to go see that.
Yeah.
But, it's a sad story in music. I know an artist in Nashville who is a major country artist who has a song that all your listeners would know and have danced to. But he's never made a penny on it, even though it sold millions, because to get where he finally wound up, he would give somebody 10% to get him there, another person 15%. And by the time he actually signed his record deal, he had already given away 100% of the song.
Jeez.
So even though the song was a multi-million seller, he never made a penny from it. But he had other songs that did.
Yeah. Sounds like almost the musical version of the Producers. Giving away so much percentage. We talked the other day, and I got a hoot out of this when you said this to me. Gary, you know more about the rock and roll business and some of the people that are in the business. Explain that one to me, because that caught me off guard. That really, after I hung up the phone with you, I went, "What is Gary talking about?" But yeah, is it true that many of these rock stars don't even have a faint idea of the history of the business they're in?
No, if they did, they'd read their contracts much more carefully, and they'd research some of these figures who really died destitute. And but you've got to know how to recover money. You've got to know how to do your contracts. You've got to have someone that you pay and trust to do those. You can't bring some guy who's an attorney who's your buddy. You need an entertainment attorney. And in Orlando, you're going to find entertainment attorneys. But in Tennessee, they all live in Nashville. So you're going to have an attorney in Nashville who does all that. They do your copyrights. You have to become obsessed with the business end. And those artists who do that, well, they're the ones who are going to survive. They're the ones who are going to make their money. That's the McCartneys and the Jaggers, all right? And then the ones who don't, well, they're the one-hit wonders. Yeah. I have a friend in Nashville. His name is Ed King, who played guitar in a group called Leonard Skinner. And he wrote the song Sweet Home Alabama with Ronnie Van Zant. However, he also played in a group from Southern California called Strawberry Alarm Clock.
Oh, yes.
And they had a song called Incense and Peppermints. Well, Ed King was one of the co-writers of Incense and Peppermints, but he never made a penny.
Because that was a big
as
song.
A teenager, as a big song, and it's on all compilations of the 60s. But what happened was they went in the studio. They brought one of their friends from high school. It was an instrumental. So the kid in high school, their buddy, wrote the lyrics. Good sense, innocence, crippled mankind. He just wrote all these jumbling lyrics, and he sang it. He wasn't even in a band. But the manager was able, in the contract, to give himself the rights to the name. Phil Spector was notorious for it.
Oh, yeah.
If he wanted the Crystals to play, any 3 or 4 girls he put on the stage that night was the Crystals, because he owned the name. It didn't have to have Lala Brooks in it, and that was it. So that's why you got to know the business. I mean, if you go to work somewhere, you're going to have to know the structure, and you're going to have to know how much you're going to get paid. You're going to have to know if you got a 401k. You're going to have to know if you get retirement. You have to do that. A lot of people, they jump too fast. So that's what I meant by that. I mean, you have to know the business.
Before we get into the McCartney story, which is one of the weirdest stories in the 60s that I can remember, what is the most outrageous myth that people think about the rock and roll business or someone in the business, and it's far from the truth?
Well, I remember in the 70s when Kiss came out. It was a time period, well, really late 70s, early 80s, when Dan Rather on CBS News announced to the world that there were hidden messages in rock songs, and many of them were satanic. Okay. All right? And when they took Kiss and said that Kiss stood for Knights in Satan's Service, and everybody believed it. To me, it was like the Salem witch trials and the yellow bird. Mm-hmm. Only the visionary girls could see the yellow bird, but everybody believed in it. Well, they asked Paul Stanley what KISS stood for, and he said, no, it doesn't stand for Knights in Satan's Service. It stands for Kids in Sunday School. So it twisted it. But, it became like, what does AC/DC stand for? After Christ, the devil comes, or Antichrist, devil's child. And it was actually from a vacuum cleaner, AC/DC. So, it doesn't matter. The myth takes off. And I remember how many songs supposedly had backward tracks, Gary. You remember this?
Oh, yeah, very well. Oh, very well. Yeah. And very, very well. But, Dan Rather has never let a bad story go in front of him go by. We all know that.
No.
That's for sure.
But it created the greatest myth. Now, I'm not saying that some rock groups didn't intentionally put hidden tracks, because I know it's true. Mm-hmm. If you listen to Fire on High by ELO, you hear this strange sounding voice that just really sends chills up your spine. But when you reverse the track, you hear Jeff Lynne say, "The music is reversible, but time is not. Turn back, turn back." He keeps saying turn back. And they asked him, they said, "What did you say turn back?" And he said, "Because if you could hear this, you were playing your record backwards and you'll probably ruin your needle. So turn back. Don't do that." So even rock artists had fun with it. So I think that's probably one of the greatest myths. And also in the late 70s, there was a rumor that record companies actually put demons in the albums to possess their listeners. Now, that gets pretty heavy. But then all of a sudden, Gary, it just died out. Mm-hmm. It stopped. And when you see Marilyn Manson and he's got his contact lens to give him that cataract in one of his eyes, outrage sells records. I mean, Robert Johnson had a cataract, and when he played, people thought it was the evil eye. So anything that brings people to your show. So, that's probably the greatest myth I can think of.
All right, we've come to that part of the show that we did the last time, and this was the greatest. I don't know if this was the greatest hoax of the 60s or whether it was just a publicity stunt hoax by Roby Young. I'm not really sure, but in 1996 you wrote "The Walrus Was Paul," and you went through every piece of evidence that you possibly could to try to figure out, is Paul McCartney really alive, or is he got a double? Did they find a double? Did he die in a car crash? And, of course, this all starts with the Abbey Road album, the cover with them walking across Abbey Road. And from here, I will let you take it from there, because I remember Roby Young when he worked in Miami. He worked with some friends of mine, Rick Shaw, Lee Sherwood, people like that. And then all of a sudden he left to go to New York. And the next thing we hear is Paul McCartney is dead. Now, I believe Paul McCartney, the man that we see today, is the same fella, much older, that we saw back then. But boy, it really ran its course for a period of a number of years. And I guess Roby made a couple of bucks off of it.
Well, I'd hope he would. But I honestly believe that Roby believed in what he was saying. Because I have an audio interview with Roby, and he's talking about one of the people from the Greenwich Village newspaper had gone to London and attended the engagement party for Paul McCartney and Jane Asher. And the person told Roby, he said, when I was there, I noticed that McCartney spent a lot more time with his female photographer than he did the actress he was going to marry. And her name was Linda Eastman. And so he said, I asked someone at Apple, I said, why's Paul spending time with her? And the guy said, oh, that's not him. That's his double. Now, that's what Roby said. Now, what I believe is a whole different thing. And I'm going to give you a bunch of perspective. Why did it happen? The Beatles stopped playing live in 1966. After 65, no shows. No matter how much money they were offered. The music changed. I mean, the Beatles went from I Want to Hold Your Hand into Revolver, and then from Revolver into Sgt. Pepper's, where they all had facial hair, and then, Magical Mystery Tour leftover albums, songs from Sgt.
Pepper's. Gary, wasn't it Rubber Soul that really started to make the change for them?
Yeah, actually, you're right. Rubber Soul was actually the beginning, and then Revolver became much more psychedelic, like with Tomorrow Never Knows, and then they branched out into Sgt. Pepper's, and they were leading the industry. So here's the thing. In 1969, Fred Laborde, who was writing an article in a Michigan newspaper, did the idea that Paul was dead and that you could see it on the cover of Abbey Road because all the Beatles were walking in step, left foot forward, except McCartney, his right foot was forward. And all of them are dressed differently. Paul and John in white, God. Ringo, the 3 black-piece suit, either the Undertaker or the Minister. Yeah. McCartney, eyes closed, barefoot, because in England they don't bury corpses with their shoes. A cigarette in his right hand, and McCartney was left-handed. He was wearing an outdated suit the Beatles had in 1966, so his suit was old. And then you had George Harrison in blue jeans and a work shirt. He was the gravedigger. And if you looked between Harrison and McCartney, there was a Volkswagen Beetle, which was the 5th Beetle on the cover, and the license plate said 28 if. And the idea was Paul McCartney would have been 28 years old if he lived. You turn the album cover on the back, you see the word Beatles on the wall, and there's a crack that runs through the S, which is to imply that it's not perfect. It's not the Beatles. Matter of fact, it doesn't say the Beatles. It just says Beatles, like it implies some are there, one may be missing. There's a series of dots in front of the word Beatles. If you connect the dots, it says 3 Beatles. And how many times did you hear John Lennon say 1 and 1 and 1 is 3? The 3 became a big thing that went with it. And then right on the wall next to the word Beatles is a skull made out of light and shadow following it. So, coincidence? Who knows? But something was up because the Beatles got very quiet about it. I mean, when I researched it, I found that you would have clues that would be totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Help album. Paul doesn't have a hat. He's different. Well, that wouldn't fit because the Beatles are touring then. And then if you took a look at guided looking, guided listening, if I showed you the yellow hyacinth flowers on the Sgt. Pepper's cover and told you it spelled out Paul ? You may not be able to see it, but once I point it out to you, you will. And it's on the cover, and you say, oh my gosh, it does say it. Or if you listen to the backward track on Strawberry Fields Forever, does John Lennon really say I buried Paul? Or is it I'm very bored? Or cranberry sauce? Because all 3 of those are supposed to be answers. You have to listen. Sometimes you need a little maybe guidance with it. But the third clues were the ones the Beatles had to plant. And I know that the greatest clue of all has to do with the Sgt. Pepper's cover. And I think this is where everything fits in. It came out, this month in 1967. And if you look at the bass drum scan, it was the only thing on the album that was not designed by Peter Blake. It was designed by a painter whose name was Joe Etgrave. And you'll see the phrase Lonely Hearts. It's a completely different font from Sgt. Pepper's Club Band. And there were 2 bass drum skins designed for the album. And the only thing they had in common was the phrase Lonely Hearts, the exact same font. If you take a straight edge mirror, and the reason you do that, because Lewis Carroll's in the crowd, who wrote Alice Adventures Through the Looking Glass. You take a straight edge mirror, place it in the center of Lonely Hearts, and it spells out a cryptic message. Going from the left, it has Roman numeral 1, and then it has O-N-E, which spells out 1 again, I-X, Roman numeral 9, he die.
Mm-hmm.
And between the he and die is a diamond-shaped arrow that points straight up to Paul McCartney and down to the grave.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I looked at it, I thought, well, one of the Beatles, the one with 9 letters, that's McCartney, he died. I thought that was too simple, because if it was, according to the legend, a cemetery scene with mourners standing over the grave of Paul McCartney, then it would have to give you a date. So the 119 becomes actually 11/11/9, November the 9th, he died. And in several Beatle publications, they mention a car accident Paul McCartney had on November the 9th, 1966 at 5 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you turn the album cover over. It's blood red. It was the first album cover ever that had lyrics printed on the back. McCartney has his back to the camera. He's different. Some people said the rumor was that he had plastic surgery. He was the imposter. Billy Shears, William Campbell, whatever. And he had his back turned to the camera. If you look at George Harrison, he's pointing with his thumb with this very stoic look on his face. And after he's pointing with his thumb, the lyrics are placed later. He's pointing to the first line of the song, She's Leaving Home, which says, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. Well, we already knew that November 9th at 5 o'clock was the time of an accident. So let's go back on the calendar. If you go back to November 9th, 1966, when the accident supposedly occurred, that was a Wednesday. So on that album cover, you have, 119, November 9th, he died, Wednesday morning, 5 o'clock. Now, the question is, why would they do this? And if it was a clue, if it was a joke, or if it was a hoax, sometimes you have to sit down and say, you know what we did? We pulled this great joke, and we had all you guys in here. John sang on Glass Onion, here's another clue for you all, the walrus says, Paul, you never caught on, so here's what you missed. Why did they shut up? And the reason they shut up was for 2 reasons. Number one, it was the sue me, sue you stage. The Beatles had broken up. They were suing everybody. Nothing that they did brought them any enjoyment, because they didn't want to be around each other. The second thing was a guy named Charles Manson, who claimed to have heard secret messages in Beatle recordings that led him to Helter Skelter, remember?
Yes.
So what if they came to L.A. and said, okay, we did put hidden messages in our songs, but we didn't mean anything to Charles Manson? That would be a nightmare. So they shut up from all that. But, they had some fun with it. John Lennon said, those freaks was right when they said you were dead, and how do you sleep? Ringo Starr in Back Off Boogaloo said, back off, meathead, don't forget that you were dead. Those were rumors that were brought up by the Beatles to inflect that. Now, I personally think it was a way to save Sgt. Pepper's. And the more I thought about it after I wrote the book, the more it has to be that, because wasn't Sgt. Pepper's a complete break from anything the Beatles had ever done?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you never heard anything like that before. The instrumentation, the use of some of the things that they did in the studio with George Martin were just they set the rock and roll industry forward so many years with the implementation of some of their techniques. Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
George Martin was an innovator beyond anybody at the time as a producer.
Exactly. He was the perfect match for the Beatles. But, here's the thing. The Beatles destroyed themselves because they could never top Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah.
They went back to the White Album, where they just guitars, bass, and drums. And one of my favorite albums, of course, is Abbey Road, which is probably one of the most beautifully placed together albums. You can hear John Lennon's side, you can hear McCartney's side at the back. But the thing is, what if Sgt. Pepper's wouldn't sell?
Yeah.
What if it fell flat? The Beatles had never had a total meltdown on any of their recordings, and they knew it was different. And so what if they said, well, for insurance, why don't we put some clues in there to suggest that Paul had died? The doll with the Aston Martin on her leg, sitting in this skeleton, or this stuffed figure with a blood-stained driving glove on its left hand and a hand over Paul's head. I mean, those things were brilliant, but probably the most brilliant part was whoever hid that message in Lonely Hearts, because I've heard it was Mal Evans, who suggested they call it Sgt. Pepper's and then put Lonely Hearts Club Band. Yeah. And even though I know that the music changed so radically with Sgt. Pepper's, you got to remember it was influenced by Brian Wilson's Pet Sounds.
Oh, exactly.
And
As a matter of fact,
sort of-
Brian Wilson said that he was going to write the greatest album ever, and he came really close to it. But here's a question for you, Gary, with the couple of minutes that we have left. At the point when they recorded Sgt. Pepper's, weren't they at that point in time just about ready to say goodbye to each other? They pretty much had it with each other. That they wanted to go their separate ways. Lennon wanted to go and live in New York and do what he was doing, and McCartney and George Harrison was off doing his stuff with the Mahi Krishna. I mean, weren't they pretty much ready to break up at that point? Something that they blamed on Yoko Ono, which wasn't true. But I mean, weren't they pretty much done with each other at that point?
Well, what's really interesting is I was fortunate enough to get to know Cynthia Lennon in 1995.
Didn't she just recently pass away?
She did. Very sad, because I will tell you this in a few seconds, is that every show that Cynthia Lennon went to, when you go to these things, these conventions, a lot of these artists will charge you for an autograph. They'll charge you for a picture. They charge you for both. Cynthia was so kind. She would sit there with a glass of wine and she would sign anything for everybody. Didn't charge anything. One of the sweetest, most gracious women I've ever met. And, you know, when you're taking a look at Sgt. Pepper's, it was a little early for the breakup. You know, you're talking about the Watt album. That's when it all hit the fan. Okay. That was the Yoko influence part. But, you know, you could tell they were growing apart because the Beatles showed you that on the cover. On the far left side, you had the Madame Tussauds Beatles, and they're all brown suits looking down at the grave. And then in the center, you had all the Beatles dressed differently, different colored outfits. They were different individuals. They were, you know, going in different directions musically. And that was good for a while because George Harrison brought in some great songs. And he was maturing as a songwriter. And when Abbey Road came out, what was the number one single off that album? And that was Something. That was written to George Harrison.
Yes.
And the Far Eastern influences that you can hear on the album. So, I mean, it actually helped it. And, you know, John and Paul had this love-hate relationship at that time. And John wanted to leave the Beatles, and Paul asked him to stay and begged him to stay. And then when the McCartney single album came out, McCartney wrote, "I've left the Beatles." And John was furious because, you know, he felt like Paul had kept him in. So that was one part there.
Well,
interesting, though. Interesting observation.
It is. And you know, it's and lastly, before I say goodbye to you, it's a shame that a lot of artists in the show business world, the first woman that they marry or the first husband they marry is not always the one that they stay with, which is really a shame because she was really a grand lady, as you have told me many, many times on the phone. We've had the pleasure of having our Gary Patterson. And Gary, where can they get a hold of you on your website and to purchase your books? The Walrus Was Paul, Hellbound's on the Trail, Take a Walk on the Wild Side. There's a bunch of other books for you. Where can they get a hold of your books, and where can they get a hold of you if they want to talk to you?
Well, good. I'd love to talk to people. You can reach me at www.rgarypatterson.com. There's a email contact there. You can buy my books at all fine bookstores. You can get it at Barnes & Noble. You can get them at Amazon.com. So they're easily found. And, you know, just drop me a line. And you're right about women, because when I get married this time, it's going to be the one I'm going to stay with. The first one.
Absolutely. Gary, thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your time. I want to remind everybody that next week we have Steve Cox joining us. He's an event planner and a really great guy who I've known for a long time. Please join me on Facebook at Gary Allen, The Express. And until next week, take care of yourselves and each other.